My guest is Alon Burstein. He's at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Welcome to the show, Alon.
Thank you, Howard.
Now, you've been doing work on terrorism and religious terrorism and political terrorism. I remember when I was involved in the peace talks, the PLO were the terrorists before they got involved in the Oslo process, and they gradually tamed. But there's a difference now. Can you briefly describe that difference?
The main difference with the situation today compared to then, I would say, is two. First of all, the PLO was the dominant body in the Palestinian population, both in the diaspora and in the territories. And then once negotiations were initiated with the PLO through Oslo and all the Y Accords and what was called Oslo II afterwards, the PLO was really the dominant force. And if you signed a treaty with them, they could then control the population. Today, you have two dominant forces. The Hamas government, which is actually effectively an illegal government in Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority, dominated by the PLO, in the West Bank, which has also been artificially prolonged for the last 5 months. And specifically, when any attempt has ever been made to negotiate with the Hamas regime as an organization or as a movement or as the elected government of the Palestinian Authority, they come with a much different background. They are a religiously motivated group, and as such it is a lot more difficult for them to find any option of compromise or any option of negotiation, because this to them is anathema. It goes against what they believe in, what they have stated to be divine law.
But even then, if you say that, after all, once upon a time, PLO said it goes against everything we believe, and then in the 80s they switched over. Is there not any reason to think that Hamas might gradually change?
Well, look, as I've stated also in my papers, I hope one day to be proven wrong, because I have a very sort of bleak outlook on the future with Hamas. But it's hard to see any option for an organization that not only defines itself by religious terms, but also defines its enemy by religious terms, and defines that any Jewish entity within what they call Greater Palestine is, in a sense, an infringement on Islam. It's very hard to see how a group like that can maintain its identity and its legitimacy within the population, as well as negotiate or compromise with Israel. The PLO never had that problem. While they always were attacking Israel, they proclaimed that their enemy was Zionism, not Jews unto themselves. They, in fact, their charter states that Jews that resided in Palestine until 1947 would be considered Palestinians, something the Hamas could never do. And as such, they had the possibility, the political possibility, to maneuver their way, employing terrorism when it suited their goals.
When you talk about employing terrorism, is the terrorism different as practiced by Hamas versus how it was practiced by PLO?
It seems that the meaning of the terrorist act is different.
What do you mean by that?
Whereas with the PLO, a terrorist act seems to be aimed very strategically in order to compel Israel into certain concessions, or the international community in the past into certain concessions, and when they don't see that terrorist activity is going to help, they halt their activities, as we saw during the Oslo period, as we see today when the PLO committee just agreed to re-enter negotiations a few days ago. The Hamas regime views terrorism as part of their holy mission, because their mission is to battle the heretic entity within Palestine. And that's why each one of their either suicide missions or martyrs that goes on a mission has a very different symbolic meaning. The terrorist actions themselves seem to be a part of their worldview. It's a part of their perception of the battle with Israel. It's not aimed to compel Israel into anything.
So it's just a functionalist versus a non-functionalist?
Pretty much.
More ideological basis of terrorism.
It's not only a functionalist and non-functionalist, it's a matter of what do you want to achieve. And the Hamas, during their bombing campaigns throughout 1994 to 2000, when they were trying very hardly to stop the Oslo process, did not present viable political demands to Israel. They were not attempting to compel Israel into any concessions or into any further withdrawals or something like that. They, in fact, were demanding the PLO stop negotiations with Israel and demanding that Israel not withdraw if this would demand a compromise from the Palestinians. So it's a very different perception on why you're employing terrorism and what you hope to achieve by it.
Is another difference perhaps that after 67, the PLO had to establish that it could act not under the patronage of an Arab state, but in its own right, whereas Hamas is under the patronage of Iran quite willingly and openly. You know, that this patronage relationship is also different, I think.
It's also different, and also there's a difference in what the states who are operating these organizations want to achieve. It's in a sense the same thing as if you look at the PLO, which was established originally in 1964 by Egypt and Jordan, and you say the states had a lot of influence, let's say, on how the organization perceives itself in its establishment. Both Egypt and Jordan have made peace with Israel. And you can see that while the outlook was we are battling Israel, there was a political agenda that Egypt and Jordan both decided to turn away from and decided to go down the path of peace. They decided this is just more lucrative for them. And if you compare that, today, I am not an expert on international relations, but I don't see what Iran has to gain by constantly threatening Israel, and what Iran has to gain by saying that the Zionist entity is soon to disappear. But it seems that when they're motivated by a religious extreme ideology, it's not that it's irrational, but it doesn't have the same rationality as we perceive it in the West of political gains, cost and effect. They are motivated by a different ideology, and then if you translate that to they're the patrons of Hamas, and in turn also you can transfer to the Hezbollah, these groups also have a very different rationale. It's not that they're irrational, but they are not attempting to achieve what we call in the West viable political achievements.
But one of the results of that is the division becomes much more greater between Hamas and PLO, and therefore between Gaza and the West Bank. And therefore the dilemma is it better for Israel to just deal with the West Bank officials and try to make some kind of a deal, knowing that Hamas won't be part of it, or does it just undercut any possibility of peace? Because if they do one-side deal, then Hamas says, see, they've sold out.
It really depends on when you ask that question. Today, we have come basically to rock bottom, I hope, in terms of the divide that Israel will have between the PLO and the Hamas, because as you said, if Israel were to negotiate with the PLO and it's viable that they would sign a peace treaty, this would have really little effect in Gaza. The Hamas controls Gaza not only through an illegal regime, but also through a very dictatorial regime. And today it would be very hard to see any external force other than a massive foreign army coming in and disposing Hamas.
But Israel could have, in the last war, it could have taken out Hamas if it has the forces to do so, and didn't do that because it said that's going too far, given the legitimacy question in the international community.
It's in a sense going too far, and it also, the question was, what would you have to gain by that? Because unless Israel had a will to reoccupy the Gaza Strip, which I think there's a vast majority in Israel against that option, you wouldn't really have a lot to gain, because the public support, as you said, would then fall for the PLO if Israel were to come in and then dispose Hamas and put the PLO in power. So it's a very problematic situation today. Today, there's still negotiations going on with the Palestinian Authority because there's sort of a general consensus that we're just going to ignore Hamas. They're an illegal government, and therefore we're going to ignore them. However, realistically, even if such an agreement were to be signed, that has no effect in Gaza, which goes back to, truth be told, throughout history. Gaza and the West Bank were two different entities. One was annexed by Jordan, one was the backwaters of Egypt. And even under the Palestinian Authority, they had two separate legal systems, which went back through decades because of their different political heritage. So today, it's very hard to say if Israel were to sign an agreement with the Palestinian Authority, would that be valid in Gaza? Because Hamas does not accept Gaza and does not accept the Palestinian Authority. And to a large degree, Hamas is working very hard to undermine the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank too. So time is running out, but that doesn't mean that there's an easy place to go to.
It's a very pessimistic picture.
Like I said, I hope to be proven wrong.
Thank you very much, Elon. I appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you.
Will Howard Cedar win a Nobel Prize? Next week's guest showed how methylation made DNA open and sensitive rather than closed and inaccessible. This pioneer in epigenetics explores how genes are turned on and off. Does biology provide insights into society? When do Jews get turned on or off religion? How do Jewish youth get turned on to defend Israel? Join us next week for Switching.